Welcome to Wellness Big Sis the Pod, a by Maven media production, where we believe you deserve real education from real experts delivered in a way you can actually use. I'm Dr. Kelsy Vick, your board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, and this podcast was built for the girl who is done feeling overwhelmed and frustrated by conflicting health noise and is ready for something she can actually trust. Every week, we have honest, science-backed conversations about your health, your hormones, your brain, your body, and everything in between. No fluff, no fear-mongering, just the truth. Because understanding your body is the most powerful thing you can do for yourself. A table full of experts built for the curious girl who wants the truth. So welcome. Your seat is waiting for you. Cortisol has a PR problem. It has been branded as the stress hormone, the belly fat hormone, and I need to push back on all of that. The peer-reviewed research tells a completely different story. Cortisol is not the enemy. A dysregulated cortisol system is. Zero cortisol is never the goal. We want to be able to work with our body's natural cortisol rhythms. Cortisol has a PR problem. It has been branded as the stress hormone, the belly fat hormone, and I need to push back on all of that because the peer-reviewed research tells a completely different story. Cortisol itself isn't the problem. I call it the misunderstood mean girl. Cortisol dysregulation is the actual problem. And in honor of the Devil Wears Prada 2, we are unpacking exactly what that means. Because Miranda Priestley's whole world is basically cortisol dysregulation in designer clothes. Welcome back to Wellness Big Sis the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsy Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. And one of my favorite things to do is relate pop culture current trends to health and wellness. I'm a huge metaphor person. I learn less by listening and more by kinesthetic awareness and then also visual. So I feel like if I'm able to relate certain concepts of the female human body to movies or activities or different things that actually have my attention in another realm, I'm better able to remember that health and wellness concept. So since The Devil Wears Prada 2 just came out, I figured what better way than to relate The Devil Wears Prada 2, that iconic movie, with cortisol and the role it actually plays within our body, rather than branding it as this mean girl, when really it is the misunderstood mean girl. So before we blame cortisol for everything, let's talk about what our lives would look like without cortisol. Cortisol gets a really bad reputation. It's blamed for belly fat. It's blamed for stress. It's called the stress hormone, which never sounds that great. It's blamed for burnout, for breakouts, for pretty much everything. But today we're going to reframe that entirely. So what actually is cortisol? And this is where we get a little bit sciencey. So if you are a nerd like me and like to understand the science, this section's for you. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone, which means that it's a hormone that directly influences how our bodies handle glucose, manage inflammation, and respond to stress. It is produced by your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. The release of cortisol from these adrenal glands is controlled by what we call the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which we can think about as our body's internal stress command center that connects our brains to hormonal communication throughout our bodies. Here's what that communication might look like. First, your brain's internal clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, detects a signal. This could be stress, it could be exercise, or it can even be the morning sunlight. They all trigger this same response. The hypothalamus fires first, the H part of that HPA axis. It releases a hormone called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, to the pituitary gland, or the P part of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA axis. The pituitary gland receives that signal and then releases ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone. ACTH is released into the bloodstream, and the adrenal glands receive that ACTH and start to produce and then release cortisol. Cortisol then travels through the bloodstream to different cells across our entire bodies. Once enough free cortisol has accumulated, it sends a signal back up to the HPA axis to stop releasing signals that help to produce cortisol. So it's a feedback loop. Here's what most people don't know. You heard me mention free cortisol. That is only about 5% of the cortisol within our bodies. The other 90 to 95% is actually bound to proteins and biologically considered inactive. So only that small fraction of cortisol, about 5%, can actually enter cells, do some of that biological work, and then send that feedback back up to the brain to tell it to slow production. This is one reason why cortisol testing is very, very nuanced. The other thing that most people don't realize is that cortisol is supposed to rhythmically pulse throughout the day, meaning we're supposed to have these elevated levels of cortisol and these depressions of cortisol throughout the day. It's not one flat line. Our cortisol is not designed to sit at a steady level. It's supposed to respond to acute stress placed on our body, whether that's morning sunlight, a workout midday, or even more of this like good stress or excitement when meeting up with a friend for coffee. It pulses rhythmically throughout the day with varying amplitudes, and it's this dynamic oscillating rhythm that our cells learn to read and respond to. When we lose that rhythmic patterning, the entire downstream communication from cortisol is affected. So here's what cortisol is actually doing for us every day. It's helping us get out of bed. Cortisol naturally peaks 30 to 45 minutes after waking. This is why there is that tip to not drink caffeine within an hour of waking. That way your body naturally has this cortisol peak, this cortisol elevation on its own without an additional stimulant or stressor in the form of caffeine. This natural peak 30 to 45 minutes after waking is supposed to happen. It raises blood pressure slightly. It gets us ready to tackle the day. Cortisol also has a role in regulating our blood sugar levels. It increases gluconeogenesis, or the production of glucose, so that our bodies, our cells, have energy for whatever the day throws at us. Cortisol also helps us to manage blood pressure and our overall cardiovascular readiness for throughout the day. It enhances vasoconstriction, or that decrease in diameter of our vasculature, which in turn raises blood pressure. And it increases cardiac output, or the volume of blood pumped out of our heart in 1 minute. Our vascular system is the way that we deliver a lot of different resources to the cells in our bodies. So cortisol helps with all of that. Cortisol actually helps to control inflammation in a properly regulated system. This is the one that might surprise most people. When we encounter different stress responses, whether that's eustress or maladaptive stress, our body might cue inflammation. And cortisol is actually a built-in anti-inflammatory that helps to control that inflammation. If you've ever heard of corticosteroids, it's an entire class of medication that works against inflammation. Some of the time it's topical, like a topical corticosteroid. Sometimes it's an internal corticosteroid injection. But in a healthily functioning cortisol system, cortisol can actually act as an anti-inflammatory. Cortisol also helps us to sharpen our overall focus under pressure. At healthy, well-timed levels, cortisol can actually enhance focus, memory consolidation, and attention. And the research confirms that this is sort of a U-shaped, where too little and too much cortisol can negatively impact cognitive function. It's this sort of Goldilocks effect where we need the right amount at the right time. So bringing it back to the Devil Wears Prada, cortisol is not Miranda Priestley. Cortisol is Emily, doing every job that needs to be done, often thanklessly, completely holding the operation together and only falling apart when pushed past a reasonable limit. So here's what a healthy cortisol rhythm actually looks like. It's high in the morning. We call this the cortisol awakening response. We expect that cortisol peak 30 to 45 minutes after waking. There's then a gradual decline throughout the day. Energy and alertness remain, but that urgency sort of softens. We expect cortisol to be the lowest at night, creating an internal environment of rest, recovery, and sleep. And then the next morning, it resets. This rhythm is not optional. It is the mechanism by which a lot of different communication happens within our bodies. When this rhythm is disrupted, that's when things downstream start to feel all out of whack. Cortisol is not the enemy. A dysregulated cortisol system is. So what does a Miranda Priestley type environment actually do to our cortisol systems, and how can they become dysregulated? If we take a look at Andy, she wasn't just exhausted. Her nervous system was running a full-blown cortisol flood every single day, which can really wear down a body. When we take a look at the acute cortisol response, the one that we want, the one that we expect, versus this chronic cortisol response, we see the differences between a healthy cortisol system and then a dysregulated cortisol system. So in an acute cortisol response, your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Something hard happens, your cortisol rises. You get this sharp increase in focus, alertness, awakeness. You handle that hard task, whatever it is, whether it's a mental task, a physical task, and then your cortisol comes back down and the system resets. This is healthy, adaptive, and exactly the way our cortisol system is supposed to function. Think about that moment when Andy gets that 2 a.m. phone call and snaps into action to deliver. Her cortisol rises, she handles the task, and then she falls back asleep. However, in chronic cortisol elevation, that never really comes back down, which is exactly what happens to Andy. Andy's body can respond to that acute stress, but if it never fully comes back down, that's when we get this domino effect, this dogpiling effect of cortisol signaling and communication that the body eventually shuts down to. So the baseline of cortisol keeps creeping up. The system never gets to fully reset. We're messing with that oscillating, that natural rhythm that we expect for cortisol. If we tie it back to the Devil Wears Prada, think of Andy's entire year at Runway. It's just one unresolved spike after another that compounds continuously with no recovery or reset built in. So what is this chronic cortisol elevation actually doing to Andy? AKA, what's it actually doing to us if we do get stuck in this period of cortisol dysregulation? The first phenomena I call the boy who cried wolf phenomena, where constant cortisol release or constant calling out blunts the response of that HPA axis in the brain. So it gets so many signals that it starts becoming less sensitive to that signal. The boy cries wolf, wolf, wolf when there's really no wolf. And then all of a sudden he cries wolf when there is a wolf. And that system is already less sensitized to his cries. Same thing happens with cortisol and that HPA axis. Over time, that stress response becomes less efficient. Our body stops responding appropriately to the real threats because we never fully got back down to that baseline. We never let the system fully reset. This is called cortisol resistance. And it's directly analogous to insulin resistance, where our body is still producing that hormone of cortisol, but these cells have stopped responding to it. The cruel truth is that cortisol elevation, chronic cortisol elevation, causes the body to actually lose cortisol's initial anti-inflammatory effect. So you end up with elevated cortisol and elevated inflammation simultaneously, not because cortisol isn't there, but because the cells can no longer hear its signal. And this has this inflammatory cascade that follows. Chronic stress activates our fight or flight nervous system and that HPA axis simultaneously. Together, they trigger pro-inflammatory responses. Cortisol is supposed to be the hormone that helps to balance that out, but in chronic cortisol elevation, it can't do its job. The result is a self-perpetuating inflammatory loop, where the hormone designed to combat this loop is shouting, 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 but no one's listening. This is why chronic stress is so difficult to push through. It's because this loop is also working against you, where the system built in to help with inflammation, to help combat that, is a part of this loop and helping to perpetuate that loop. In chronic cortisol elevation, there's also a body weight and metabolism issue that comes into play. Cortisol plays a direct role in metabolism, appetite regulation, and adipose or fat tissue distribution within our bodies, particularly visceral fat storage, which is that dangerous fat, that organ-lined fat that increases our risk for a lot of different diseases. Chronic cortisol elevation is linked to obesity development, not because of a lack of willpower or a lack of trying or laziness, but due to the actual hormonal responses that are happening within your body and this cycle that your body just can't get out of. Chronic cortisol elevation drives the body towards fat storage, primarily around the midsection. It also, as we said earlier, kicks up that fight or flight response, meaning your rest, your digest response is blunted. This is why high stress seasons might bring a little bit of weight gain or unexplained cravings, like all of a sudden you're having cravings for foods that you didn't previously have before, even if you're trying to do everything right. It's not a discipline problem. It's a communication problem within our bodies. Linking it back to the Devil Wears Prada, Andy spent an entire year in a body that never fully came back down from this high alert state. She wasn't just tired. Every system in her body was paying a compounding biological cost from this high stress environment that looked like exhaustion, emotional fragility, and overall just energy depletion. She's not being dramatic. That's researched physiology. So people with this chronic cortisol elevation and this dysregulated cortisol system aren't just weak, exhausted, or lacking willpower. Our bodies were just never designed to run the Miranda sleep protocol all the time. And your body will find ways to tell you that. And that chatter will only get louder and louder and louder. Here's how you can tell if your cortisol rhythm is also like Andy's and living in this Miranda sleep protocol where it is always on high alert and can't actually ever reset. And as a hint, it doesn't show up as this dramatic entrance. It's this slow build over time. And it can show up as a long list of things that you've been saying is just a lack of sleep or getting older or a certain time in your cycle. But also, this is not a diagnostic segment. These are just things that can happen. And since cortisol is a hormone and can affect so many things within your body, a lot of the symptoms will show up in a lot of different systems within your body. So definitely not diagnostic, but something to look out for, especially if you think your body is ever fighting against you when it comes to how it responds to stress. So some warning signs: you might be waking up exhausted or not fully refreshed. This can be indicative of that cortisol awakening response being blunted and that rhythm being off. You might feel like you need caffeine immediately upon waking in order to help with that response, like add a little bit of an assistance to what was supposed to be happening in your natural cortisol rhythm. You might be feeling anxious, overwhelmed, or wired before the day has actually begun. This can indicate cortisol may be spiking too high, too fast. You might also feel genuinely foggy and slow within the first few hours of waking. That's not supposed to happen. Cortisol can help with focus and attention. So this is a sign that your cortisol levels might be a little bit out of balance. A few of the daytime signs: you might experience energy crashes, especially in that 2 to 4 p.m. window, that feels disproportionate to your activity level and amount of sleep that night. Every time I'm saying these, I'm thinking of new moms, and obviously certain things have to be sacrificed in certain phases of life. So I think paying a little bit extra attention to things that you can help with that cortisol rhythm, knowing that there are nights that you are not going to get very much sleep or you have to wake up earlier than your body would ideally want you to. During the day, you might also feel a little bit of brain fog, slow, sluggish. You might experience more cravings. All of these can be signs of a dysregulated cortisol system. You might experience digestive issues. Again, that sympathetic fight or flight nervous system is increased in chronic cortisol elevation, meaning that parasympathetic, that rest, digest part of your nervous system is taking a back seat and not necessarily able to accomplish all of the jobs that it has under its role. You might also realize you're getting sick a little more frequently. In the evening, you might experience this like wired but tired feeling where your energy might be low throughout the entire day. All of a sudden, right before you go to bed, you're like wired even though you know that you're exhausted. You might experience getting a second wind around that 9 or 10 p.m. time. This can often be mistaken for a natural night owl tendency, when in reality, it's just a cortisol curve that's shifted later than it should be. If you're waking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. with a racing mind or a sense of this like low-grade anxiety that you can't fully explain, that can indicate cortisol imbalance. Or falling asleep fine, but waking up feeling completely unrestored. Another sign is that you feel like you have to rely on wine or alcohol or melatonin or different sleep aids in order to help you sleep. Emotionally, you might feel a little bit more reactive or have trouble regulating your emotions. You might have memory lapses or times when you don't actually remember something that you feel like you should have remembered. You might have difficulty making decisions, and you might just feel like emotionally drained, flat, detached, where things that used to excite you might not excite you anymore. Physically, you might see unexplained weight gain, especially around the midsection. You might see skin changes, menstrual cycle changes, low libido, chronic muscle tension, hair thinning, or increased shedding. There's a lot of different physical symptoms you might see in this sort of chronically elevated cortisol state. So these are just a few signs to know if you might be struggling with an imbalanced cortisol system. Again, cortisol is not the bad guy, but these are some signs and symptoms to look out for. And a lot of these also fit under the umbrella of a lot of other health conditions as well. So this is not just like 1 + 1 = 2. It's the body is a puzzle, but maybe those signs and symptoms can help you figure out your body as a puzzle a little bit better. So let's zoom in a little bit on this sleep cortisol connection, since we've learned that cortisol is particularly affected by our circadian rhythm and can influence how awake we feel in the mornings and how well we're able to go to sleep at night. There was a 2024 study done at UCLA that looked at cortisol levels in young women and how they affect their sleep. They found that higher pre-sleep cortisol predicted shorter sleep time, lower sleep efficiency, and longer time to fall asleep that same night. Shorter duration and poorer sleep then produced a flatter cortisol slope that next day, meaning they're not reaching the peaks that you would expect. So each of those factors, sleep and cortisol, disrupt the other. If cortisol is affected, it's going to affect sleep. If sleep's affected, it's going to affect cortisol functioning throughout the rest of the day. Zooming in and taking a look at Andy in this sort of high alert, high stress environment, that stress would elevate her nighttime cortisol levels, which then disrupts your sleep quality, which further dysregulates her cortisol rhythm the next day, which makes stress harder to manage, which elevates cortisol again, which feeds back into sleep, and this loop just cycles through. As a side note, if you listened to our glymphatic system episode on brain cleansing, you will understand a lot of this. So I'll leave that link below if you guys missed that episode, but we talk about the importance of sleep on brain cleansing and actually detoxing and being able to clear out different waste products within our brains. These two episodes will tie together perfectly. And of course, linking it back to the Devil Wears Prada 2, remember when Andy's phone would go off in the middle of the night and she'd jolt awake immediately? That's not just a narrative device or a script. That's actually what's happening physiologically when we talk about a dysregulated cortisol system. It's this unpredictable chronic activation that keeps cortisol elevated throughout the night when it is supposed to be at its lowest points. And it prevents the nervous system from ever fully recovering from that chronic stress throughout the day. So how can we actually work with our cortisol systems, especially in a high demand life like Andy has when working for Miranda Priestley? You don't have to necessarily quit your job or move to the countryside or become a Buddhist monk in order to find this peace and work with your cortisol system. Although more power to you if that is what you choose to do. You need a few specific evidence-based tools to add in your toolkit to help. And as a reminder, the goal is never zero cortisol. People struggle with too low of cortisol as well. There is an actual disease state. And let me tell you, one of my best friend's moms struggles with this, and it is not something that should be our goal. Zero cortisol is never the goal. We want to be able to work with our body's natural cortisol rhythms and understand when signs and symptoms of cortisol imbalance show up within our bodies so that we can be more purposeful in helping our bodies to rebalance and get back on the right rhythm of cortisol elevation and depression throughout the day. So tool number one, we want morning anchoring. Our bodies should naturally elevate cortisol in the morning, again, 30 to 45 minutes after waking. So we want to work with that. We can view natural light in the morning within 30 minutes of waking. Moving our bodies also helps with that morning anchoring, even if it is just 10 minutes. Eating a real balanced breakfast with good protein, fats, and carbohydrates can help balance our blood sugar, which is a role of cortisol. What works against this natural cortisol rhythm? Reaching immediately for your phone, beginning that day in a highly reactive state after checking your emails, skipping breakfast, or any sort of high stress. So as a recommendation for Andy, maybe 10 minutes of morning sunlight, a little bit of movement to help work with that natural cortisol rhythm. Tool number two, the right form of exercise. And this is where I want to proceed with caution because high intensity interval training, sprint interval training have been given a bad reputation because of cortisol. It is great. Our bodies as women need those forms of exercise. But if your body is in this chronically stressed, chronic cortisol elevation state, we might need to adjust that a little bit to allow our bodies to reset and not be in this like higher threshold of cortisol state and then performing high intensity interval training and sprint interval training on top of that. So if you're working out in the morning, high intensity interval training, sprint interval training, great. If you're working out close to bedtime, A, don't recommend, but B, if you have to, you feel like you need movement, maybe choose a slower, more breathwork based form of movement, whether that's a walk, whether that is yoga, something where you're able to pair your breath work, tapping into that parasympathetic nervous system with an easier, lower intensity form of movement. And if you're stuck in this chronically elevated state and you're doing high intensity interval training workouts and sprint interval training workouts and not seeing any progress, try maybe more low intensity exercises for a period of time This is not forever, and it's not for everyone. Sometimes people might still benefit from those high intensity interval training and sprint training when they are in this chronic cortisol elevation state, but worth it to experiment, especially knowing that when our cortisol is chronically elevated, that sympathetic nervous system is kicked into overdrive. So if we can use exercise as a way to tap into that parasympathetic nervous system, it might help out with some of our symptoms and some of those feedback loops that are sent to our brains. Tool number 3, sleep first, everything else secondary. Sleep is so important for everything, but especially if you are experiencing high alert, high stress environment and feel like your body hasn't fully been able to reset after a super hard workday or super big push in your life. Try resetting with consistent sleep and wake times, a genuine wind down period, 60 to 90 minutes before, avoiding high stimulation before bed, especially screens, which I know is so easy to revert to before bed. Sleeping in a cool, dark room, and then avoiding things that affect your sleep, like sleeping aids or alcohol. Tool number 4, mindfulness. Again, any sort of breath work, meditation that taps into that parasympathetic nervous system is going to help when we're in a high stress state. There was a peer-reviewed research study that found that mindfulness-based interventions produced a statistically significant improvement in cortisol secretion in healthy adults. And what it really came down to was consistency. It wasn't the intensity of a single session, but it was the consistency throughout the research study that yielded the best results when it came to improving cortisol. So what did this look like practically? 10 to 15 minutes of intentional breath work or meditation daily, which included slow, controlled breathing that directly helps to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. And they found that consistent small doses always outperform long, intense ones that happen very few times. And lastly, tool number 5, which is way easier said than done, but to reduce the overall load on the system. All the cortisol tools in the world can't move the needle if the load is not properly managed. If you're still running high alert, high stress 24 hours a day, but you're trying to get your sleep, your morning sunlight, your movement, your yoga, your mindfulness, but you're still running on high alert the rest of the time, nothing is going to move the needle as much as just helping to reduce that load or working to reduce that load in some way. It might be worth it to try and identify what is the thing that is causing me the most sustained cortisol activation. Not necessarily the acute stressors, but the always on background ones. The ones that say you always have to be on, that you're never enough. The ones that have you on always on availability or trying to reach this never enough standard. Try and create boundaries surrounding activities or mindsets that create this high stress environment for you and this overall chronic load. The other way to combat this chronic load is social connection. Friendship heals, right? So bringing other people in to help be that support system for you is huge when it comes to this chronic cortisol elevation. Andy's problem wasn't that she couldn't handle stress. Her problem was that she was living inside a system specifically designed to generate continuous cortisol activation with zero recovery time built in. The solution wasn't become tougher. It was to recognize what the system was doing to her body and choosing differently. And it's not weakness, it's just biology meeting wisdom. The Devil Wears Prada gave us a lot of cerulean, a fear of Miranda, and honestly, the perfect picture of what happens when a human body runs on chronic stress with no recovery. Don't be Andy. Or at least, if you are Andy right now, give yourself what she never got. The information to understand what's actually happening within your body and the tools to actually do something about it. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. A little Devil Wears Prada mixed with cortisol education. I love talking about cortisol. I think it's so important, especially with all of the misinformation out there about cortisol. So I hope you guys understand that system a little bit better. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Devil Wears Prada, cortisol, the human body, and I will see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Big Sis, the pod.